Alright, let's look at Barbarians at the Gates. Oh, what I've been playing. Hey, these boxes. I think I noted this before. Compass's boxes are beginning to emulate the armored boxes that GMT provides. So, got mixed feelings on this one. Very, very mixed feelings. There's some things I like, and a lot of critical points that I want to raise against it that really kind of hurt it from different perspectives. Let's look at components to begin with, because that's the easiest thing, right? Nice hard map. I mean, in terms of the cost and, the sort of objective quality of the components, it's very high. But got this map. It's a point-to-point map. It does something very nice in terms of taking the bubble map issue that point-to-point maps have and kind of making it fade away with these very light connections between areas, and the spaces themselves are kind of muted as well, as are the colors of the map. Now, some people, not me, some people have noted though that for at least certain forms of color blindness or on inability to disambiguate, this is really problematic. I didn't have any issues with it, but I'll have to take their word for it. I actually found the map very, very appealing as it started. But as you play more and more of it, you end up putting control markers down, and technically, what I did is sort of a shortcut that's suggested in the game, and that I want it for both ease of mechanical aspects, but also for appearance. They don't have to be on the board to begin with. All the territories are kind of controlled by one side or the other at the beginning of the game, by one of the many factions in this game. It's a two-player game, but there's multiple factions or powers. But as you begin to play more and more, the situation becomes more chaotic, and you need control markers all over the place, and that takes from the beauty. There's just no way to get around that. There might be answers, like I'm thinking some kind of pale colored tiddlywinks or something might kind of do the job better than the counters do. I don't have enough tiddlywinks, and mine are not pale enough colored. I'm thinking, maybe kind of a yellowish brown, and what else? Maybe a clear or something like that to distinguish between the two colors. But it actually is worse than that because, like I said, there's multiple powers, and you really need 4 different types of control marker for the game. And they have them in terms of the actual markers. One of the problems with those markers, and I'm going to cover this with the map rather than anywhere else, is that they're too small compared to the counters for the game. So these are the control marker sizes, these are the unit sizes. The control markers end up sitting underneath and you can't really see. You can move them on top, you can put them to the sides. All of these have issues of one sort or another as compared to other games that this kind of derives from. I'm thinking in particular, your We the People, Hannibal, and Sword of Rome. The designer points out, Napoleonic Wars, all of those come with big circular control markers, which fill the entire space and are colored in such a way that you can kind of see what something is, even though there are pieces on top of it. The pieces may be smaller, whatever. In fact, I think they usually are. So some of the design decisions in terms of what components to use for what went against the norm here and actually make the game a little less playable in that sense. Another thing in the components, again, fantastic quality counters, thick thick counters. They pop out. They don't need any clipping or anything like that. It just, you know, the quality of everything these days has gotten so good. But again, there's 4 powers, but essentially only 2 colors are used. The 2 colors for the 2 players. So counters that are Roman don't look all that different from counters that are Roman allied. And there's an important distinction, and you have to keep those apart. The control markers are pretty easy to tell, but the troop markers not so much. Similarly, the usurper counters look very similar to the barbarian tribal stuff. And again, there's a different picture on each unit. So you've got this picture for tribal and, let's see, well, and this picture for the Roman, and they're distinguishable, but normally you want something that grabs your eyes a little bit more. I think different shading would have helped a great deal, or even a completely different color for the usurpers and a slightly different color for the barbarian ally, for the Roman barbarian allies. There is a tiny difference between the barbarian allies, the allied forces, and the Roman forces in color. It's not enough to really help. It really doesn't do the trick. Also came with a huge quantity of blank counters. Now, printing cost is basically by the size of what you're putting out, and it feels like kind of a waste to have this big a bag of, you know, high quality blank counters. Is there anything they could have been used for? I don't know. It might have been possible. Now, there's so many control markers. See, what I was going to say is it might have been possible to make the control markers the bigger circles or something along that line. But, you know, I really don't think so, because there are quite a few control markers to handle the whole map. And unlike most of the games of this type, instead of there just being, you know, 1 control marker per space on the map, there's actually 2. Because you have to cover the case of both Roman, and they treat those as loyalist versus usurper on the same side, on the same counters, versus barbarian, which has free barbarians versus allied ones. So you have 4 different types of counters, or 4 different symbols, and only 2 sides to each counter. So you can't just do the normal flip or whatever. I was very happy with the cards in terms of, again, the quality of cards. I just harp on this, but man, these are just about perfect. In terms of in terms of the quality of cards, I don't think Compass has put out a game that has what I consider the lesser quality of cards, which are probably more expensive. GMT puts these out in their sort of deluxe games that are really kind of hard, and they almost feel like they're going to shatter in your hands. They can hardly be shuffled, etc. These guys shuffle perfectly fine. They're great in terms of that, but the text on them is in this italic, and the layout with the text, etc. It's not easy to read the italic text. I don't know if this is just a personal problem, but it's something that goes through the entirety of the graphic design of this game, to the point where the player aids, again, you know, nice quality stock, blank on one side in each case. But again, everything's written in italic, and it's almost impossible, for me at least, to process that kind of, the information presented in that way. It feels, I don't know, like it's de-emphasized or something. This player aid is fine. It has an additional scenario that there wasn't room apparently in the rule book for. Dice. Dice are dice. They put good dice in here, I guess. I never liked the larger dice. It's just a personal thing. And then the red, I wish it was a little darker, a lot darker. I don't know. This one I like. But the red has sort of a, I don't know, a weird quality to it that I'm just not thrilled with. The rule book is a mess. I'm not going to say these are the worst rules or anything like that. I don't tend to, first of all, I have experience with much, much worse. It tries to track the GMT style of presenting rules, which is never the best. But it does it, and I looked over my Sword of Rome as an example, and I saw much of the same kind of layout in terms of rules with exceptions and examples all kind of embedded in this mass. I don't find that terribly useful to begin with, but then on top of that, this is on a high gloss paper, and then they made the odd choice of putting exceptions, notes, and examples all in a bold italic text. And the headers for things in kind of a paler text that kind of fades into the book. In addition, there are quite a few errors, quite a few omissions, quite a few ambiguities, and there's some, a little over 4 pages, I'm going to call it 5, pages of errata currently. And in conjunction with the errata, it's still, the rules still don't manage to answer my questions. Now, I've had somebody point out that there is an extended example of play in here that maybe, in the playbook, that maybe covers some of the questions, or at least one of them that I had. I don't think it actually did, but I couldn't find it because there was no reference to that. This is going to contain the scenarios. I found the layout of the scenarios, again, just, I don't know if it's the graphic layout or what it is, but something about the way it's all set up just really doesn't work for me. And then these bold colors, they were usable, but they then detract from what you're reading here. Just like all the pictures, and there are quite a few pictures within here, also detract from the kind of understanding that I get from sort of the optimal rule books. And I would say the best rule books that I've ever seen are the ones put out by the gamers on really, so that's another issue, on really good stock paper, clean white, decent amount of white space. They use the third of the page in the margins on each page for the examples, exceptions, notes, stuff like that. Instead of embedding it in there. It's got multiple columns. Now, some of this, the main rule book has 2 columns, which is helpful. But then when we get here, we're looking at just straight across. And the errata is the same way as this. And, trying to deal with 5 pages of errata straight across, not easy. Another thing is, and this was the thing I wanted to mention, all glossy paper. It's becoming such a common feature. You can't write on glossy paper. But with the quantity of errata that there was in here, I don't know that I would have had the heart to do so. All right. That's pretty much the physical components. For the play of the game, a significant portion of the game is going to be spent trying to look in the roles, because the actual roles, not just are they bad, but they're also, I think, more complex than the base rules to a lot of other CDGs. They cover a number of different facets. Let's see if I have the... No table of contents for the rulebook itself. There's tables of contents for sections of the rulebook, which is kind of odd. The rules themselves cover more than most of your CDGs. Virgin Queen might be an exception to that. That may be, and I didn't like that because of the complexity. This one is, I think, less than that. But I found myself quite often trying to have to look up special cases or things that I couldn't remember how they quite worked, because there are so many different systems, and the systems are different for different powers involved. So, like, you know, Romans, loyalists work a little different in different ways from usurpers, and both of them work differently from tribal forces, and then the allied forces have differences. And so these are not really summarized in singular places. So there's no easy place to go look up if you want to see, hey, what are the special cases about Romans? Or necessarily, what are the special cases about what happens when a victory occurs, you know, with a tribal unit on there? Or what happens when, you know, a leader is displaced or something like that? And they're kind of mishmashed in different places. So, like, in some cases, you might want to be looking up the particular event that's happening, like, is it a displacement? In other cases, it might be in the stacking rules. In some cases, it's under its particular power rules. And it's usually not repeated nor referenced. Maybe 50-50 on the referencing, as to where you can find a particular thing. So there were times where I'm trying to page through, trying to use my memory of the rule book, and this rule book, for the reasons that I've already pointed out, having to do with the formatting and everything, is really bad, at least for me, to be able to remember where to find something in terms of pages and whatnot. GMT is just as bad. Don't worry about that. But I do find that when I looked, like, at the Sword of Rome rules, I was able, even though I haven't looked at those rules in 10 years, to find exactly what I wanted within a minute or so. With these rules, although I've read them recently, multiple times, I found myself spending 5, 6, 10 minutes looking for something. Part of that may be that if I don't find it in here, I run upstairs and get on the computer and see if it's in the damn errata, you know. Part of that being, hey, maybe it's in the playbook, because some of the stuff is in there. Not much in terms of core rules, but in terms of victory conditions, stuff like that, because the scenarios are all in here. So there is that. Let's take a look at... I think the sequence of play is probably the best place for me to capture things. Oh, and then, yeah, I mean, there's notes down here having to do with the actions that you can take, and it's just not, it's not the best organized. I don't know if there's an easier way to organize it. Sometimes there's charts that I expect to exist and they don't. Are there charts that I don't use? No. If anything, they went, you know, kind of heavy in terms of the summaries that they gave. So it's just, it can't be complete. So there are things I expected to find that I couldn't find on here. But other things that maybe I didn't use, like reinforcements, I would look in the rule book for that. But it is as reasonable to be here as anything. One thing that I think is key to this whole endeavor is that there was no developer assigned to this game. And I view the developer... So the designer has this idea of the game and brings it to life and works it and molds it to try to get it to work. And in some cases, maybe they rely on a developer to help them with that task. Okay. You don't need a developer for that, right? I mean, that's almost a co-design situation when you get to that. What you need a developer for is to be an advocate for two things. One, for the company, the publisher, to be able to say things like, yeah, you know, we're not going to be able to give you that many counters, and maybe try to come up with some ideas on limiting that. But also to getting the playtesters, etc., arranged and set up in such a way that you're getting feedback from people who have never seen the game before. And that you've got trusted people and whatever. And also to be someone without quite as much devotion to the game, who are able to look at it with a very, very critical eye and say, you know, this isn't working, or you need to correct this kind of stuff and whatnot. It's funny, I looked, there's a copy editor credited, which would go a long way. But, well, it's not a copy editor. It's a component proofer. Component proofing is given credit. I've never seen that before. But it clearly wasn't someone who was trying to proofread the rules for clarity and also align that with, you know, can I play the game after I read these rules? There are play testers listed, but no blind testers. Does that mean anything? I don't know, you know. But there's basically a core playtesting group, which looking at the names and what I know, I think are probably other Dutch people. Probably one little group. It almost feels like this was done by one little group in terms of the playtesting. So again, if your playtesting group is primarily, you know, people you've taught the game to and been working it through, they're never going to get that. You know, I mean, I look at the names, and one of them is a family member. One I know is in the Netherlands. Another one has a very Dutch-sounding name, and then the final one does not. But that doesn't mean it's not like all one kind of gaming group, which is kind of it fits in too well with what I'm seeing here, as though there was no real external effort to make this game work for people who hadn't been kind of intimately involved in it for a long time, and therefore might not see the problems. You know, they read through the rules and they're like, yeah, I understand that, we know that, yeah, that makes sense, yeah, that makes sense. It's kind of like when I used to do copy editing, I always felt like it was a bad idea. I would do the first round of it and come up with corrections, and then I would get the corrections back, and it'd be kind of like, you know, it almost feels like it should go for another round to someone else, because I'm not the person who should be doing this. I've already given you my input. You're trying to match that. All I can do is say, yeah, you did it, or no, we're still not connecting on the right level here, which is kind of the, yeah, maybe farming it out in multiple rounds. Now, the business of gaming being what it is these days, that may or may not be possible, but I'm always an advocate for that. This game has been around in development for a long time, from what the designer told me, which means there probably should have been time to send it out, but it may not have been like polished enough and ready for a real like playtest kit to go out to people. So I don't know. Anyway, let's start looking at the different subsystems and talk about it, and then I'll give kind of overall views that I haven't given, at least on this video, I think. So, I mean, it is a CDG. You start out dealing out a hand of cards. It took me a while to find out that it's 7 cards per person, but that's spelled out right here. So if I was looking at this and not trying to learn from the rules alone, that would have been easier. But that is something important. Everything needs to kind of be in the rules. It was in there, I think. No, maybe not. Anyway, you deal out cards, but the Roman player has sort of a special tribal reserve. As he starts creating allied tribal as he starts allying tribes and giving them, settlements, some of his cards don't go in his hand, and he doesn't have the same kind of control over them. The way he uses those when he's going to play them is to declare what he's going to try to do with them and flip one over. And if it can do it, fine. If it's not enough points to do it, then he can keep drawing from that or supplement from his hand in order to do the action he wanted to do with that leader. Or he can just say, screw it, I'll throw that card away. Another important facet of that is the events don't end up, as far as I can tell, this I don't think was clearly handled in the rules, but I think the events can't be played out of the tribal reserve, which is somewhat, I mean, there's nothing that says they can. There's nothing that says they can't either, but, it would require all kind of weirdness if you could, and I think there would have to be something to specify that you could do it. So that actually weakens the Roman player's hand a little bit more as he starts creating the tribal reserve. Now, he does have a card which allows him to have a little bit more tribal reserve than otherwise, which is kind of cool, but it gets played late in the game. Then you do the strategy phase where you're playing cards to do things, right? This is your standard CDG mechanism here. And there are a number of different actions you can do. They can't all be done by everyone. Your main movement is going to be done through leader activation, where you have to pay equal to the initiative rating of the leader to get action points. But it's a little different from most prior CDGs. Most CDGs worked with, you pay, and it's either yes or no. You either get to use that leader or you don't, and you get a certain amount of points with them. With this, your action point card, if you have more action points than, or if you have more ops points than you need, you get more action points. If you have less, you get less, although there's a case where you can't play it at all. You can also play your 3 operations cards as reinforcements. You can play cards to migrate the different tribal markers around, which is a very powerful capability once Rome's borders break, to really throw them into hell, because you're able to move what's really quite a large force around. You can't engage in battles or sieges with this, but you're able to move around and convert a lot of spaces. And that's going to be kind of your goal in the game, is to knock the Roman player down so that they don't control many provinces and they start losing points every turn. You can supplement that by plunder and by victory point cards and stuff like that. But for the most part, what the barbarians are going to be trying to do is they're going to be trying to make it so that the Romans don't control any provinces, because then they'll start bleeding points so fast that they can't play. Now, you can do some clever things within that, and maybe I'll talk about that if I can. Well, why don't I talk about it now? So you have 2 powers, you have 4 powers in the game. The barbarian player controls the usurpers and the barbarian tribes. The Roman player controls the loyalist Romans and allied tribes. Tribes generally become allied when the Roman can't deal with them anymore and has a specific card, and he can give them part of a province, a provincial capital indeed, which means he has a very limited number of these he can do. Plus he doesn't have many of these cards. There's not much will to just grant everything aside. For the Roman player to control provinces, he has to have the provincial capital under one of his powers, either Roman or allied, and more than half of the provincial territories as a whole. Which means the onus is on the Romans to keep things, right? The usurper can go and capture big hunks of provinces and set himself up so that he's damaging Roman control in a lot of places without necessarily achieving control for himself. And that's actually very powerful, because the Roman player is going to have a special option, which is he can once per turn, discard one of his cards from his hand and declare that he's switching places with the usurper. But that may not help him, because the usurper may be standing on no points, but depriving the Roman loyalists of a lot of points in the same process. So it's a kind of interesting situation where you're doing kind of gamey things with the usurper in order to deprive the Roman of any opportunities to reverse his fortunes or anything like that, and just make it so that no matter who's winning this civil war at any given time, until it's ended, Rome isn't going to control. The Roman player is going to be taking negative points. Anyway, migration is one option. Raiding is another option that I barely used. I think I did a little bit, maybe just through cards that the event gave me raiding. That allows barbarians to kind of move around in larger quantities. Well, no. A number of combat units equal to the ops rating of the strategy card, but they have a lot of movement points. So if they have a lot of stuff they want to plunder, they can run around and plunder a lot of stuff with this card. It's more efficient than the migrations, I guess. So like a 3-point strategy card for raiding could get you 30 action points worth of movement, which could plunder like 15 areas, conceivably. There's not going to be that many available to you, though. But a 1-point raiding card could get you 10 action points, which could get you 5. A 1-point migration card is probably going to get you at most, well, late in the game it can get you 3 spaces, which I think, given the configuration of the map, might get you 5 points of plunder. But it does allow you. No, it won't. Yeah, it will, because it's not. It's fortifications, not cities. But it's just. It's not going to get you as many points for plunder, but it will allow you to take more important places, which is kind of valuable, and it allows you to move your barbarian tribal center, which gets to migrate for free at the end of every turn. So it kind of sets you up in a better position than the raids do. I may have underutilized my raids, though. There's Force March, which basically lets you move individual CUs to reinforce combat units, strength points, whatever, to reinforce places where you might need them. You're able to move twice as many as the ops point of the card. So if you have a scattered force that you need to bring together, it could be useful. I barely used that as well. The successful usurpation, which I already just talked about a little while ago, where the Romans discard a card and get to swap places with their usurper. You can pass if you have less cards than your opponent, forcing them to take another turn. And that can happen because there's reactive cards and whatnot. And you can play a card as an event during your action, which is pretty standard for CDGs. You have kind of the choice, do you want to play it for ops or event? But there's a lot of different choices for ops, and they all kind of work a little differently. Like, I don't know. It feels like there's a little bit more, it's a little harder to grasp all the things you can do properly with the points on your card. And they're also limited by which side you are to a greater extent than in most games. In most games, there's sort of this core. In this game, there's kind of not a core, except for the activate leader for X number of points, X being related to the leader's initiative and the value of the card. Okay. But the main of the play is going to be happening in that strategy phase. And that's when, you're doing your movement, you're doing your battles, you're doing your sieges, for the most part. The battles are using something that's not on these cards, but it's on the board. But it's basically a comparison of strength point to a die roll. You get die roll modifiers based on your leadership, your tactical rating, which will also affect reaction moves, interceptions, and withdrawal. What it's called? Is it called withdrawal? Is it called something else? I don't know what it's called. Avoid battle. And these are pretty common and close to the rules that exist in other CDGs. There's concepts like campaigns where you're allowed to move multiple forces at the same time, and if they manage to combine, you might get a larger battle force than you normally could, or one that's not allowed to stack together. Like I said, there's, you know, stacking is like a lot of different permutations based on the type of space it is and the powers involved and whatnot. You know, nothing is made simple because of the 4 different powers and the, there's like, in terms of spaces that you might be stacking, and there's 1, 2, 3 different types of spaces, and they all kind of, there's no simple chart to break that down. I don't know if there could be. But anyway, once you get done with your card plays, and you play them all out, there's no holding or anything like that. You hit an attrition phase. If you're in any locations that you don't own, you have to make a roll on an attrition table. The larger your force, the more you lose. And then you hit a control phase, where if you're sitting on a territory that you don't own, that's not fortified, you get control of it automatically. Normally it's going to cost you an action point to switch an area. Although, again, there's special cases where it costs 0 action points. No, that's not the case. There's special cases where you're allowed to siege for 0 action points. I don't know why you're not allowed to convert spaces for 0 after a battle. But anyway. After a battle, quite often you have to actually spend an extra action point to continue spending action points, which can really make your movement painful. I found the counting the number of action points that I have kind of painful, because you could have honestly up to 8, is it? No, up to 6. You could have up to 6, and you know, you're stopping doing a battle and maybe siege rolls and whatnot, maybe looking up a bunch of rules to figure out what happened from that battle or siege. So I was using these markers for that, but you certainly don't need this many. One set, you need like a set of 6 markers. A die would work, you know, for how many action points you have available, probably. Oh, yeah. And then you also get a free siege attempt if you meet the qualifications for a siege, which is 3 strength points in the space. Now you're allowed to just stick around in the space and die slowly if you don't have the capability to siege it. And the siege is handled again on a simple table, which actually is here. And the modifier is basically if you're Roman, you get a bonus. But there might be other things that give you bonuses for that. Sieges are going to cost you 2 action points. Some of the movements cost you more than 1 action point. Movements by sea or straits cost more. They cost like 3 each. And movements over rough terrain cost 2. And over rivers cost 2. And again, all these different terrains, they're handled as the connections. So this is a normal clear, this is a rough, this is a straight. And there might be special cases surrounding each of those in terms of what you can retreat over and whatnot. It all makes sense when you get through it, but it's hard to remember all the cases. What I generally found was I would have to sometimes look things up. Not so much because I couldn't remember vaguely that there's a penalty, like you can't retreat over rivers or straits, and you can't retreat through it. Well, you can retreat through enemy territory, but it's like what the penalty is for each given instance is kind of a pain in the ass, and it's something you do have to look up and figure out. And there's just a lot of the game is that kind of rules. Now, point-to-point games just have that problem. This one takes it up a notch and makes it worse, which might not be so bad if the rule book was really, really well organized. But the rule book is, like most CDGs have, that I've seen, have pretty piss-poor rule books, to tell you the truth, because most of them were made by GMT. But, and I know some people like GMT's rules. I'm sorry. This is far inferior to the GMT rule books and makes it even more complicated. And when I say, you know, the GMT rule books are bad, I don't know if it's an effect of the point-to-point rules or if it's more how they present their rule book itself. I do find that area movement games tend to be a little easier to understand, and I find it very hard to see why, because they're essentially representing the exact same thing. Of course, you can make the argument that hex grids are essentially point-to-point movement too. They just have a more regularized point-to-point movement with, you know, different things mattering. I find those different things easier to express in a chart form. So maybe it's just that nobody's figured out how to present the charts properly for CDGs or for bubble maps, because it's the bubble map that's really the issue there. Okay, anyway, the final thing in the control phase is any usurper spaces that can't trace back to either a usurper fortification or strength point or leader turn loyalist. This means that the loyalists don't have to go out and conquer islands, and it's possible that like a usurper area can be cut off and converted. Kind of feels like a We the People type thing, but not as Go-like, more like, yeah, you're cut off. There's nothing similar to that for the loyalists, though. Of course, the onus is on the loyalists to control provinces, but it does end up feeling a little weird that, like, this area is just loyal, you know, because nobody's done anything to it. It stays loyal forever until somebody switches it over. Then you get a migrations phase where, kind of like the migrations that were done during the movement, the barbarian is, in fact, must migrate all of his tribes at least a space. But they don't necessarily have to go towards anything. So all it really does is requires that you have a couple of places you can move back and forth to. There's no sense of like this impending pressure coming from the east that existed in like the Invasions game, which was really a wonder to behold for all the problems that game has. So, you know, you can kind of bounce back and forth between two spaces if you want to. However, migration is a very powerful tool in the hands of the barbarian player because, A, it allows him to move his tribal center and his source of reinforcements safely without any risk, and it also allows him to convert the spaces that it moves over kind of for free. That includes cities without sieging them, which is very, very powerful, gets you a decent amount of plunder. And overall, I find it largely to the barbarians' advantage to move things as you would expect them to move historically, but not always. Regarding movement, the barbarians have some capability to move overseas, but that's limited by the ownership of Britain. Once there's no more loyalist cities in Britain or ports, fortified ports is actually what it comes down to, which includes cities. Then you start seeing Vikings type invasions of Spain and stuff like that happening, which can be very very frightening indeed. And it's only the loyalists who prevent you. It's not the usurper. See, this is the whole thing. The usurper is sort of this appendage to the barbarian player, as opposed to something that's trying to capture provinces on his own and win the throne, and the usurpers are not interested in preventing the barbarian raids. So actually, what I found myself doing was opening up usurper spaces so that the barbarians could move in and plunder them. It felt very, very gamey in a lot of ways. Just like the usurper not trying to take a whole province, but instead just make sure that the Romans don't get points for it. Felt very gamey in a lot of ways. Anyway, after that, the Roman player scores based on how many provinces he has. In the scenario I was playing, he has to have 7 provinces. If he has more than that, he gets bonus victory points. Got lots of bonus victory points early in the game. If he has less than that, he gets negative victory points. Got tons and tons of negative victory points late in the game. And I kind of felt like, ooh, how can the Romans lose this game? Until things changed, and then it was like, wow, how can they stop the barbarians and the usurpers and everything from just wrecking them? Then you get a reinforcement phase. The reinforcements for the barbarians end up going in their tribal center, and that includes the allied ones, although they get less reinforcements because they're kind of settling down and becoming less militant. The usurpers get theirs based on where their leaders are, and the loyalists get theirs based on controlling loyalist-owned provincial capitals. Again, different rules for every single faction in terms of what they get. It's sort of this steady flow of troops, but eventually what I found was the Romans just weren't getting anything because they didn't control anything, and that makes it harder for them to get stuff back. Some of their event cards might help them, but the game ended early because I couldn't figure out how to stop the barbarian flood once the borders broke. That is entirely historical. In fact, it's not very historical at all. What you had was the borders breaking, a wave coming in, Rome maybe not being able to defend itself, but things settling down. And then the migrations start again. And I don't know if Invasions did a particularly better job of that. I'm trying to remember. Certainly, the fact that the barbarians would engage each other in invasions and had to squabble over the same territories created a more reasonable solution, I think, overall. They also had target areas that they were going for, which feels very Britannia-like, but and I don't like that, right? Here, I kind of like the fact that the barbarians are okay. They don't care where they're going to end up. They're just looking for places to plunder and settle or whatever. But there's no mechanism that really makes them kind of settle down. So, for example, let's look at the Franks. Historically, the Franks made their way into Gaul. The Romans didn't settle them in Gaul. They made their way in there, and then they kind of just settled down. At least that's my understanding of them. They didn't continue pillaging or putting pressure on the Romans. Now that may be an indication of the tribal marker being removed somehow, but it's removed generally by being defeated. And I don't feel like that applies to the Franks either. I feel like they moved in and they settled into being a kingdom. The Lombards, same thing. They moved in and they settled on their own, right? So, like, the goal of the barbarians should be settling. Whether they get it through the Romans giving it to them, or they get it through reaching some place and saying, we're happy here and we're not going to keep moving and we're going to stop being as tribal and start settling down and becoming more agrarian. What kind of mechanism is going to make that happen? I don't know. Like I said, Invasions chooses to do it with targets. Like there are places you want to be, and that's where you want to declare your settlement. I feel more that declaring that you want to settle is a reasonable solution to it all, but that's not this game. This game is all about the barbarians doing everything they can, along with the usurpers, to, in a particular manner, take provinces away from the Romans. From a very high-level view, it may kind of appear like things are happening sort of historically, because sometimes the barbarians aren't able to press as hard as you might think they would or whatever. But if a big force breaks through, it can still do lots of damage, and it just keeps moving until it kind of wants to try to find a place where it can just move around and plunder stuff or whatever. Or it stops getting used and builds up more force, maybe becoming a kingdom or something. I'm trying to think of a way to do kind of some sort of explanation that fits the historical pattern. Certainly what I found in play did not feel at all historical. So like the Picts invaded, took half of Britain, and then just kept wandering back and forth as a tribe because they had to keep migrating. They didn't have any kind of option to settle, any desire to. But while they were wandering around, they were waiting for the usurpers to leave so that they could take more. Anyway, whatever. You also get your leaders back, and this is something else that feels kind of strange. So, usurper leaders, if they get removed from the board, they're gone forever. Okay, whatever. And they get removed from the board by, like, having their troops destroyed or, you know, something along those lines, or being sieged. If the Romans lose a leader, if he's an emperor, he goes away. Otherwise, he's there for the rest he stays on the board for the rest of the game. He keeps coming back. He goes into a displaced leader box, which kind of means that you have this, I don't know how to put it, because what's happening is you might want to get a leader displaced in order to get him back if he'd be useful somewhere else. If he's not terribly useful with the troops he's stacked with. It might be better for his troops to die off, so he comes back and you get to place him somewhere more useful where you don't have to pay points to try to get your leader into play. Again, feels weird, and it feels like you're making decisions that don't really work, and nothing really aligns quite right. For the barbarians, when they displace, they also generally go off the board and can be returned to their tribal center at the end of the game, at the end of each turn during the reinforcement phase. But they usually only have one leader. And if someone can wipe out their tribal, if the Romans can wipe out their, because nobody else really wants to, the usurpers could. If the Romans wipe out their tribal center while that leader is displaced or in a space he doesn't control, say sieging a town, the entire tribe's just destroyed. The leader goes away. The tribal force that maybe was sieging a town may have to retreat. It's horrible, man. It's horrible. So you saw tribes disappearing relatively quickly in an ahistorical fashion. Like they'd have a lot of troops on the ground, but sort of the tribal center would go away and there'd be no impetus from those troops. Now some other tribe could absorb those troops, for whatever that means. So it doesn't necessarily hurt the barbarian player as much as you might think it does. And hey, maybe the tribe settled down somewhere. It's not like, you know, you don't necessarily know all the intricacies of what's going on in the way that you do in Invasions. But it is definitely, there's something that you're not looking into, that you're not seeing, that you have to make up and add to your story. It doesn't necessarily absolutely clash, though. I'm sure I had had something else I was trying to say there. I wasn't trying to poop, I swear. Yeah. And that's really about it. Now, I said I had mixed feelings. And why am I saying that? I mean, it sounds like everything I've said is pretty much negative about it. Yeah. When trying to look at it as some sort of historical simulation, yeah, it is. When trying to look at it as a game, if you can get over the lousy rules, and if you can internalize them and know them, or if maybe somebody rewrote them and printed the player aids so that they were, not in stupid italics and stuff like that, I actually had a lot of fun with the strategy of the play. You can make the same kind of argument for Washington's War, to tell you the truth. I felt like the game did not feel like a simulation particularly in the way that, like, Wilderness War did. But I felt like I was having a lot of fun with the strategic elements of it, with the gameplay aspects of it. I thought there were a lot of clever things going into that. And from that point of view, I have to say, yeah, I had fun with the kind of choices that I had, with the kind of gamey manipulations I had. That said, it is relatively swingy. This is not going to be a game that, like, you're going to have your chess masters, or people who are the wannabe chess masters of the competitive gaming cycle or clan wanting to play particularly. There's too much randomness. There's too much, sieges, attrition, stuff like that. It can really all wipe you out on a single die roll. The combat, everything's all on like one die versus one die. So where a buckets of dice system might even out your luck a great deal. Sure, the tails might be ridiculously scary, but here, singular dice can make a huge difference in terms of what you're going to face. And CRTs in some games tend to be a little bit more, a little bit less random than this one. This one tends to cause some pretty big effects. Although honestly, the combat table isn't. That's not the case for the combat table. The combat table tends to give pretty nice, smooth results, pretty light results, and you usually do a point of damage to the enemy, and he does a little bit more to you, or whatever. I mean, you can often predict what the victory is going to be there, and be pretty sure of it. And the idea of winning or losing a combat usually isn't a game breaker. Although every now and then you can't retreat, and boom, a whole force goes away and an entire nation is gone and whatever. And that's okay. I don't mind a lot of randomness. I really like it in my simulations because I believe simulations without randomness stop being simulations at all. They're too predictable. I think a fair amount of randomness is necessary to account for the amount of stuff that the people who are providing the inputs in a simulation don't know. Things like the weather. Some of the cards may feel like they have impacts that aren't, so a lot of times with CDGs I make this argument of, look, what human is making this decision, or what group of humans are making this decision of whether to spend these points to mobilize reinforcements or move forces or fire off an event? I don't feel that problem with this game because I don't feel like I am a group of humans. I don't feel like that I'm human agency, especially in the case of the Barbarians. In the case of the Barbarians, I feel like my goals are not the goals of the Barbarians or the Usurpers or anybody. My goals are the anti-Roman evil devil. I'm the thing that's trying to destroy Rome, and that's it. That's all I care about, right? As the Romans, I feel a little bit more alignment with both the Romans and the Allied tribes that they're working with. And with the limitations there. So it's kind of a weird dichotomy where, you know, one of the players does feel sort of associated, the other one doesn't at all. But in a lot of ways, I kind of just don't mind that there are those really big events that, you know, control when the tribes show up and stuff like that. That you have control over that, or you might move some other tribe. When the reality of the history is it's the continuing pressure of the different tribal units that's forcing things forward. That's not being represented here at all. It is an invasion, but so what I'm getting at with that is, if I look at Sword of Rome, I also don't mind. I feel like the events are on such a grand scale, grander than this in actuality in terms of time period, I think, that it's okay that I'm just the god of this country, rather than like I'm, you know, the human decision makers at any level or another. Whereas, you know, with Here I Stand, I kind of feel like I'm making more human choices, and I might call out, look, I got a bad weather card. That doesn't really make sense. I also felt like the cards here were actually more reasonable than they are in most CDGs. Certainly of this scope and whatnot. I felt like they could actually be aligned more to the humans, except for like the barbarian waves, being able to control that. That felt a little weird to me. But most of the others, it felt like, yeah, you know, the Roman loyalists are putting a certain amount of effort into drilling new leaders and growing new commanders over the period of time, rather than engaging in, you know, expensive battles that wipe out their commander or something along that line. I have 3 games other than this on the subject matter. One of them I haven't played because it came with no rules at all. It's a PDF of rules. And the subject matter being kind of Rome versus the Barbarians. Well, let's say I've got 4. I don't know that first one's name. I'm so miserable that I bought it because, again, it didn't come with a physical copy of the rules. The rest of it looks great. I've heard good things about it. I don't know. I've got Invasions, which I've brought up a number of times here. That is Philip Thibault's game. Was a Kickstarter. I think this was a Kickstarter too. But I bought it through the company directly or whatever, somehow or another. Although I may have prepaid. I think you had to. Invasions has horribly messy rules that are worse than these, right? By far. There's definite things missing in them. It's also mechanically more painful and complicated than this is. It is audacious in its scope. It's essentially a Britannia-style game covering the waves of invaders. But let's take Britannia, let's take its most complicated variant, which was Hispania, and let's just square that level of complexity. Let's just make the most complicated Britannia-style game we can, and make it more military aligned. Hispania is also more military aligned, but this one is even more so. I'm kind of disappointed with that. I was hoping for something less Britannia-like and more like Thibault's other designs, which are La Grande Guerre and Europa Universalis, 2 of my very favorite games of all. I've got to give it another shot. I can't, you know, I can't just put it aside like I did, but... Third one is Fall of Rome, the old SPI solitaire game, which is really an exercise in, like most solitaire games, in trying to manage the odds. You can, and trying to play optimal play against the system in terms of, you know, scoring some points and whatever. I never find solo design games, well, I seldom find solo design games to be very engaging. They either rely way heavily on randomness, where you're just sort of buffeting, and conceivably you could still optimize play over that, but the randomness is so heavy that and so obscured that it's hard to calculate out everything, or they become puzzle games. And I feel like sort of Fall of Rome is more of a puzzle game side of things, in that you can calculate out what the odds of everything are and determine your optimal move with, you know, about as much time as it would take to just play the game. You can instead figure out your optimal moves each turn in about the same amount of time. And that's just no fun for me. I mean, that's like doing Sudoku or something, whatever. I can see why some people like it. I don't. And then the final one that I would put forward is Imperium Romanum, which does cover this period, covers every period from like Middle Republic on, but it covers things in little scenarios, and it doesn't try to do this scope. Where the invasions are happening, you're probably fighting one of these civil wars in the midst of an invasion, and chances are the person who wins the game, like the scenarios are set up so the person who wins the game is the person who's Rome at the end of it. I was thinking something like this might serve as a framework around which you could generate those scenarios, but there's not enough connection to the reality in that game to be able to present this. And there quite simply aren't enough usurpations. And it doesn't distinguish between who's usurping against who. But anyway, like I said, I had actually fun playing it, even though I think as a historical game, it more or less doesn't provide you with much in that sense. But as a historically themed game, I thought it provided some really interesting gameplay situations. If only the rules were a little bit better. As such, since I kind of give it a rating based on being historical, it's hard to tell, right? Like, I want a certain level of simulation and representation of the history when I'm playing a historical game. So I rate it kind of low because I give it like a 6. And consider that that's including a point drop at least for the shitty rules. Whereas there's games I've given a 10 that have a point drop for the shitty rules. But, you know, they just deserve it in spite of the rules. They do. This one, you know, I would have loved it before I found Wargaming, but it does not give enough of the story. And what it does give of the story is flawed. And then on top of that, there's the gamey aspects and whatnot, which also spoil any ability. Like, even if it was doing a better job, the gamey aspects would hit it. But, you know, they're part of what I'm hitting it against there anyway. So disregard that, man. But, yeah, disappointing overall. Disappointing overall. And the quality of the rules is such that this was sort of the first time I read these rules, which was quite a while ago. And I read them again before I played this, and then I read them in the intro. The first time I looked at these, it was kind of the decision of, I can't buy Compass games anymore. And it's not just for this one. This is not the only one in the lineage. Basically, Compass had a bad reputation. I agreed with its bad reputation. There came a period where I was getting games by Compass that the rules were okay. They weren't a total fucking mess. But the fact that in 2022 they're publishing this without a developer assigned to it to protect the company's interests and the players' interests, and it comes out a mess, you know, I just can't trust them. I can't trust them. And what that means is, for the most part, I can trust GMT, as an example, to put out a certain quality of game. And when they failed, they made it good. They said, you know what, you're right. These rules are a mess. I'm thinking of things like One by the Sword here. We're not only going to rewrite the rules, which is what Multiman did with Lincoln, but we're going to send you a printed copy of the rules because you bought a game that came with printed rules. I've never touched Lincoln again because its rules, you know, they made living rules that fixed everything supposedly. Well, screw that, man. I bought a game that came with printed rules. I should have a game that comes with printed rules. Certainly there can be a certain amount of errata. And is 4 pages ridiculous? No, but the quality of these rules overall, when we go from presentation, when we go from ambiguities, when we go from the amount of errata and the amount of errata that needs to be there that's not there still, this is a pretty big mess, in my opinion. However, can you play it? Yeah. Do you have to make some shit up? Sure. You know, some of the cards have to be interpreted. Some of the special edge cases may not be being covered completely. And I don't mind that when the rules are nice and light. So I'm going to bring up the case of Marlboro. Now, Marlboro has some of the worst rules that I've ever seen, right? Not the worst, but they're in that bottom 5%, right? There are huge ambiguities there. There are missing tables, all kind of stuff like that. But quite honestly, the rules were written sparsely enough that although there was some pain in finding out that there wasn't a rule for something, you could almost assume there wasn't a rule for something if you didn't remember it. And the hard part was finding the rules when you did remember them. But you could almost assume there wasn't a rule for something and just start making shit up. And I don't mind that as much as I mind rules that are detailed enough that I know that there's probably something there, but I have to spend 10 minutes to find it. And that, you know, that's just the nature of it. And then when I do spend the 10 minutes, I may have found something where I still am not sure of the answer afterwards, which was the case definitely with this one in a number of situations. Anyway, that's my view on this one.